let's jump back in to the very end of Torah Dalet in Likutei Moharan, where the Rebbe has been demonstrating how all of what we've been learning about now for the past couple of days really shows up very beautifully and deeply in this vision of Rabba Bar Bar Chana. So let's just run through that very quickly again, and then we'll move on to today's Amud. Rabba Bar Bar Chana tells a story about how he was once at sea and he saw a boat, or he was on the boat rather, and he saw a huge fish. That there was a little sheretz, some kind of creature, some kind of small sheretz going into the nostril of this fish. The fish died. The water compelled the fish out of the ocean, and it pushed it onto the gudya, pushed it onto the boundary, onto the border between the ocean and the city. It rolled over and it destroyed 60 cities. Now from this huge fish, 60 cities came and they were able to chop this thing up and eat all of the meat. Right? We decided. One of the chavras sent me, when they sent me from Google, that it is called meat. It's a fish, but right? But it is meat. Okay, good. So it was able to eat from this meat of the fish. And then 60 other cities were able to come and salt fish and take fish away from this huge, gigantic fish. And they were able to draw out 300 buckets of oil from one eye socket of this incredibly large fish. Rabba Bar Bar Chana says, when I came back 12 months later, they were chopping up the bones of this fish and they were using it to rebuild the cities that the fish had destroyed. So the tzaddik over here tells us that everything that we've been learning in Torah Dalet about Tikkun HaMalchus and about what that means for Averis, for deviations from the will of the divine that are creating boundaries between us and the realization of Malchus to Kedusha, right? That this whole world, going back to Torah Aleph, is a levana that's reflecting the light of the sun. That this whole world is differentiated letters that are really all ultimately rooted in the singular will of the divine, and that true das, being the conjugation of chasadim and gevuras, is ultimately for the purpose of us recognizing that kol ma'orosav heim l'tevasai, that everything that happens to a person is ultimately for their best. The averos that fortify a sense of independence, a sense of control, right? A sense of self-fortifying life perspective. That those can be ultimately rectified by the experience, said the Rebbe, of coming in front of a tzaddik and connecting to the tzaddik in these three ways. The way number one was just coming into the presence of the tzaddik, seeing the tzaddik. That's number one. Number two, said the Rebbe, is giving tzedakah to the tzaddik. And number three is ultimately reciting the vidui, which is all the tzirufei oisios, right, of the letters that are etched into the bones in a certain sense that enable a person to speak out what's going on for them in front of the presence of a very humble, non-judgmental tzaddik, that the tzaddik thereby is able to guide that person on a derech that is lefi their shorish neshmaso. In so doing, the tzaddik helps the person come to tshuva. Tshuva is the retrospective realization that not only is everything that happens to me for the best, but even the things that I myself am responsible for, ostensibly on the surface, right, that I myself made certain choices, that I myself sunk into certain behaviors, is ultimately recognized through the retrospective light of tshuva. That the fact is that the Averis are nepchin, are transformed into schuyas. Mamish, an incredible thing. So the Rebbe sees all of that hinted to in this mimer from Rabbi Bar Chana. Let's go through it quickly. Says the tzaddik, the kavra is the Jewish person. There's a sheretz that goes through his nostrils. We learned in Torah Beis that nostrils, the sense of smell, is connected very much to Mashiach, right? Mashiach is Tefillah, David HaMelech, Vani Tefillah, everything that we learned in Torah Beis, and that's connected to V'hareicha b'yiras Hashem. We said about the Mashiach, Uti Ilasi Echtam, right? The Tehillah, praise, Tefillah is connected to Chotem, connected to the concept of a nose. And that's mevalbel with the person because the person can't daven properly. So what are you going to do? You have to go to a soul doctor, right? Get diagnosed, figure out what medicine to take. And so here he goes through this process 3 times. 1, 2, 3. And the Rebbe says that it counts it from the final one, which is the most intense, which is when a person actually builds an honest relationship with the tzaddik, feels comfortable unburdening themselves before in the presence of the tzaddik. And the tzaddik, again, being so humble, is v'ish chacham yichaperena. There's a special inyan where the tzaddik is able to help the person be mechaper for their sins. Oiver al pesha l'she'eris l'mishamesim atzme k'shirayim. Moshe Rabbeinu v'im ayin mechenina. Right, that whole drasha there. So, number one is v'shadi l'guda. It compelled the person onto the guda. Guda is a boundary. Says Rebbe Nachman, that boundary is a reference to the tzaddik who's constantly making boundaries. Right? That's the guda. Umesa. Mesa is vidoy kalamumase misvadeim. V'idchu maya is the aspect of tzedakah which you cast onto the waters and it returns to you, which it, even in this mimer, it ultimately ends up returning to the person. V'shadi l'guda, and then the person comes close and approaches. So he was doing these three things. Mesa, vidoy, idchu maya, tzedakah, v'shadi l'guda, and then he approached in order to get close to the tzaddik, which is level number one, right? Says the Rebbe, then through this process of vidui dvarim, which is the tikkun for malchus to sitra achra, that it's ultimately able to rise and to become in the person's life a malchus to kedusha. That's hinted to in v'charav mina shittin v'chayze, because shishim heima malachos, malchus is connected to 60, charav mina shittin v'chayze, got rid of the malchus there, sitra achra. And then, as a result of the tzedakah, as a result of the shefa, that gets rid of the two midas ra'os, or the three midas ra'os, because atzvos and atzlos are connected under domim, right? Together with taiva, that are rooted in these two layers of existence, which is domim and someach, the inanimate and the plant life. Chai medaber, or rather, it's all backwards, right? So first, he's speaking about the two that are rooted in Chai Medaber, which is Dvar B'Telim and Gaiva, that cause Anios, right? And so V'achlu Min HaShittim Echayze is that he was the beneficiary of the Shefa that's coming down through this experience of having nullified these two Midas Rois that are rooted in Chai and Medaber, which is Dvar B'Telim and Gaiva. And then Umalachim Min HaShittim Echayze, on account of coming close to the Tzaddik, that the tzaddik is called a bris melach olam. Through that, ultimately, the two midos ra'os of daimim and someach, right, which we mentioned earlier, which is atzvos, atzlos, laziness and depression under domim, and then taiva is someach, is able to be completely undone on account of the tzaddik who is who is the bris melach olam. And here's where we're up to as we continue this drasha explaining the Maimor of Rabba Bar Bar Chana. And he says, michad galgala de'ena plus me'agarve mishcha. Yeah, maybe if you can close it there. Thank you. They were able to draw from one of the sockets of the eyes of this fish 300 buckets of oil. Garve mishcha, says the Rebbe, Zabachinas das. This is an aspect. If you take the whole thing, Beklali is what are we trying to accomplish in getting close to the tzaddik and being mevatel our negative midos that are rooted in all of these different layers? We're trying to get to das. We're trying to get with the true lived embodied experience of chasadim and gevuras being completely and entirely identical and two sides of the same coin, and that coin is a coin of the divine. Sebechinas das. Now how do we know? What does oil have to do with das? Because the pasuk says, "Ki shemen mishchas kodesh." Shemen is this holy aspect of being able to anoint. Shemen mishchas kodesh. Azebechinas seichel. Shemen mishchas kodesh. If you could look on with one of the chevra, maybe. Shemen mishchas kodesh is always a reference to seichel, and this is because shemen in the Zohar Kadosh is associated with the sphere of Chochmah, for the very basic physiological reason that just in its physical symbol, where does shemen go? Always rises to the top, right? That's a b'china of Reishis Chochmah, right? Which is positioned at the top, at the outset, at the beginning of any creative process. Oil always rises above, and it's always a symbol for Chochmah. So they were able to draw out of the eye socket, this whole experience, tons of oil, And it's not stam that it came from the eye socket, because the eye is a bechina of Chochmah. Right? We've been learning this with the Chevra, I'm sure, many times, is that Binah is connected to the ears, to hearing, and the eyes are always connected to Chochmah, to seeing, because Binah is the details, the particulars. You can only hear one sound at a time, and seeing Chochmah is the big picture vision, which includes both Chochmah and Binah that emerges from it. So it includes all the details at one within the bigger picture, which is itself an early Bechina of Chesed and Geulah, right? Because Chochmah and Binah are the roots of duality, right? From our perspective, where it splits into right and left. Because before that, you just have Keser, or Mamish, everything is so one that you can't even say about it, Baruch Dayan Emes and Baruch HaTov HaMeitiv. That's the ultimate, is when it's going to be completely and entirely unified. Chochmah and Binah, seeing and hearing, are themselves the Bechina, early root, because in that place there's no din at all, right? Because din only starts from the underside of Binah as it splits into the Midas. But on that level, it's an early root of din from the standpoint of either something being completely unified, Chochmah, or being sort of fragmented into separate parts, which can seem on a very, 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 very early level that ultimately unfolds through Gevura and Hoid right later on. It can seem as being something that conceals Hashem, because Hashem is Echad, right? And so any manifestation of differentiation, even if it's held within the unity, is the early root for Gevura, and that ultimately is Nishtalshal later on in the system of the spheres to becoming things that we actually perceive as literally separate off from the good God, because that doesn't look good and He is good, and how do you figure that out, right? And so Chochmah and Binah is seeing and hearing, and so it's only reasonable and natural that they would be drawing this shemen, which is Chochmah, out of the Chad Galgala De'ena. Utlas meya zebechinas Moshe. So why 300? What's that remez? Says the Rebbe, 300 is the aspect of Moshe Rabbeinu. Shu bechinas ma shad tzadik maktenes atzmei bechinas ma. Because Moshe Rabbeinu, which is the tzaddik who's able to accomplish all this, has to be absolutely batel, like we learned. Vanachnu ma. Moshe Rabbeinu was totally, absolutely nullified, lagabe de ein sof, like we learned. He had a spashtus hagashmi as he went up to a place where his identity was completely non-existent or nullified, melted into the ocean of the divine. And that's the aspect of ma. Me'a, ma. So what's 300? Right? 3 me'a, 300. Says the Rebbe, because you have to humble yourself and ourselves, and the tzaddik humbles himself or herself. There are 3 ways that the tzaddik needs to nullify himself. The pasuk in Yirmiyahu, Al yishalhel chacham gibar v'asher. Let not the chacham, the gibar, the ashir, the wise man, the strong person, and the wealthy person be yishalel. Don't be prideful. And so you see there are 3 aspects in which a person needs to do the opposite of Yishalel, which is Al Yishalel, which is the Bechina of Ma. Ma is humility. 300 Ma represents the 3 aspects of humility that a person needs to humble themselves, because Moshe Rabbeinu was certainly a Chacham and a Gibar and an Ashir. Nimtza shebechol bechinas me'elu shlosh bechinas unasem ma. A person has to nullify themselves. Through that, a person will be able to come to total and entire leaving behind of the body. Leaving behind, it's not just the body, but it means the ego. It means the sense of self in all of its aspects. And medabik ba'ar ein sof, and to bind himself to the infinite light of Hashem. She'in sham shum shinoi ratzon, where there is no distinction. El Hashem hu halikim. Everything is emerging from one singular ratzon lehetiv, and even though it doesn't appear to us to be that way, says Rebbe Nachman, we just learned in Sichos Ran earlier this week. That's a big praise for Hashem when you ask questions on God, right? Because if we wouldn't have any questions on Hashem, like we said yesterday, I think you would be Him. You would be Him, And we're going to learn later in Likutei Moharan also the 5 things that separate between our consciousness and God's consciousness, completely beyond us. But this is where Emunah comes in. And Emunah will actually fundamentally alter the way that you live life in a very, very real way. This is the aspect of the Chad Galgala De'ena, because what I said before related to Chochmah being connected to the sense of vision, which is true for both eyes. But what's this Nakuda where they drew out the 300 buckets of oil, Shemen, Mishchas Kodesh, Chochmah, 300, Tlas, Ma, right? Those three aspects, because Mea is Ma, as we're going to see in a minute, and it's three because Chacham, Gibar, Ashir. So why did that come Mechad Galgala De'ena? So it's very, very deep and beautiful.
So just to clarify,
Sure.
Ma represents 100,
Yes.
which we will see in a bit.
Yes.
And Chacham Gibar, the Ashir, is 3 times Ma.
Well, basically, yes, because, right, you have to be Ma in those three aspects of Chacham, Gibar, Ashir, absolutely. So why one? Why Chad Galgala De'ena? What does it tell us? It drew from both of the eye sockets, maybe 600 buckets. What's this Nakuda of one eye? So Kamuva Be'idra says, such a beautiful Zara Kadosh, that Elizimna Da'aseh, that in time to come, Yishtakachba, we're going to perceive HaKadosh Baruch Hu as looking down at us with what's called Eina Chada Derachme, a singular vision of Rachmanas, Eina Chada Derachme, which is one of the reasons that fish are so incredibly exalted. Because seeing is nimshach from HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hashkacha. Right? We say HaKadosh Baruch Hu's meitzitz min hacharakim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's looking, right? Hashkifa mimayin kadshcha min hashamayim. That's where sight comes from. It means the ability to be mashgiach. Do you know fish do not have eyelids? You know their eyes are just open the whole time. Fish is an aspect, mamish, a strange thing, but fish in Kabbalah are incredibly elevated. One of the reasons why we're supposed to eat fish on Shabbos, Shalashud Dafka. Yeah, Dafka Shalashud because of this reason. Because Shabbos, it's a little bit of a taste of the time when we're going to experience the total hashgacha of a Kodesh Baruch Hu, unmitigated hashgacha. And Stam Remez that I heard, it's in my head because I heard it from Reb Shlomo Chesed Zatzal in the name of his father. He said his father would say this all the time: Ha'oichel dag, b'yayim dag, person who eats fish on the day of Dag, which is 7, right? Because 4 and 3, like we said earlier in Torah Beis, Nitzel mi Dag, gets saved from worry. Dag is Daiga, right? A person who eats Dag, behind Dag, Nitzel mi Dag. Very high thing.
It's just an aleph added to the Dag.
Yeah.
It's always
you bring the aleph in.
For sure.
Right? Unbelievable. So that's the Nakuda over here. There's a Eina Chada Derachme. That's the Bechina of this fish in the first place. Thank you guys for joining us. Have an amazing day. Try to catch a recording if you can. And that's the aspect of that ultimate day where there's just goodness, because you recognize that the whole thing is straight ratzon, is straight hashkacha, and it's just the will of God. So nimsa kishat tzaddik oise atzmei ma, when the tzaddik is mevatel himself, he's immediately shining, like it's almost like a spotlight. You know, when a person gets himself out of the way, you remove all the impediments, the obstacles, like the Kotzker's famous Torah, right? Ani I made whatever the pasuk is, right? Moshe Rabbeinu says, I stood between you and Hashem. I can't remember the lashon. And the Kotzker says it's always the I that stands between you and Hashem. If you get that out of the way, so you're just mamish in the spotlight of the divine. Good things, bad things. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is running your life, and He's good, and He knows what He's doing, and He knows things that you cannot possibly know. And there's Gilgulim, and there's Inyanim and Tikkunim, and we don't know anything. We don't know anything. It's unbelievable. We're so limited. And so Gevalt, but through Emunah, a person can come to the highest level of Bittul. Bittul, all of a sudden, you look up, and there's just one loving eye. There's not even two. It's just mamish from the Ratzon Elyon. And so the tzaddik is drawing that down into his life. Through Ma, he's connected to the Chad, Eina Chada Derachme. Hainu le'ein sof. Once the tzaddik goes up to that place through Ma, and he's completely mevatel his ani, and ani, when it's mevatel, the letters swap around and it becomes ayin, right? Ani turns into ayin, it opens up, and a person nullifies themselves to the Ritzayin Ein Sof through emunah, through bittul. But Rebbe Nachman told us it's got to be Ratzav V'Shoiv. You can go up to that place, but you have to come back into your guf. Az mamshich me'arin soif ha'achdas ha'ratzon ha'pashal shadarach ha'mashalai v'nasami ma'mea. So then he went up to that place because of Ma, and he was able, through being mevatel, the three aspects of Chacham, Gibar, Asher, to become one with the Ein Echad Derachme, and in that place it's the letter Aleph. When he comes back down, he takes the Aleph and he draws it back down into his Ma, and that gives you the word Mea. Fascinatingly enough, the word Moshe is Ma and Shin. right? So Shin is the class Mea, right? Is the 300, and that's the result of the Ma on either side. It's Moshe. Kamoisha Amru Al Tikri Ma Elamea Chazal say, right? It's the shares of the Mea Bracha. It's Ma Shem Lekecha Ashoel Me'imach. God is asking Ma Al Tikri Ma Ela Mea V'Naset Tlas Mea Mitlas Ma, and it becomes 3 times Mea, right? Because it's 3 times Ma from Chacham Gibar Ashir, and this is the remez that they drew out of its eye socket, its singular eye socket, which is the Ein Chada de Rachme, 300 buckets of Shemen Chochmah. 300 is Chacham Gibar Ashir, 100 is Ma, and the ability to draw down the Aleph into the Ma. And he brings that down into his intellect. This oil, we already learned, alludes to this incredible way of looking at the world, right? Because when you go in Bittul, you're rising above the Chochmah. When it comes back down into your Klei HaMoichin, and a person can start actually through the Emunah process, beginning to think in this Emunah-oriented way, beginning to respond, to react to circumstances, situations in life, be able to plan their next steps, be able to really orient themselves. Like, what do I actually want to do with my life? And that's influenced by this realization that's really not about me, and really there's so much going on beyond me, and really I'm just a tiny spark in this gigantic torch, and this fire, like I called it a wildfire recently, a wildfire, Beis Yaakov Le'esh, Beis Yosef Lahava of Knesset Yisrael. A person recognizes that, a person's thinking changes. A person's thinking changes, and that's where the seichel comes from. Good morning, thanks for joining. And that's the bechina of Ata Hareis Haladas, Shemamshich Arin Soif L'Daitaya, where a person is able to rise to that place and haresa and have a ha'ara, have a place where a person's shown certain things, and then you bring it ladas, you bring it into your intellect, Shemamshich Arin Soif L'Daitaya Sheyida Achdos, where a person comes to really know the oneness and to really, really begin to mamish live like that, where you realize this is not just theory, this is not just, it's really true. It's meant to impact us. It's meant to have an emotional impact on our mood, to the extent that we can really, really know this, not just intellectually, but to draw it down into our lives. So I don't think the Rebbe is giving a psak, right? I don't think that the Rebbe means over here that instead of saying Baruch Daina Emes, a person is on that level as mamish saying Baruch Atayva Metiv. But the person is living on the level where even though they're saying Baruch Daina Emes, because they're still human, they know inside Hatayva Metiv. And a person could get to that level. Tzaddikim got to that level. That's the aspect of what the Rebbe already said in Torah Aleph, because it's all connected, and that's why I'm happy that we're learning it this way, because you can see the interconnectivity. It's one Inyan that's building up. So the Rebbe said in Torah Aleph that when a person is zoiche to make a connection between the Nun and the Ches, which is the Levana, that it should be connected to the Shemesh, so you see the world as being illuminated with the presence of the divine. Remember what the Rebbe said? Va'az naseh ara Levana ka'arachama, right? Then, in the person's own life, the Levana will become like the Arachama. What's that? Levana will become like the Arachama. It's a pasuk in Yeshayahu referring to La'asid Lavai. And we said, well, there's Geulah Klalis, there's a collective redemption, and there's a Geulah Pratis, and the Baal Shem Tov taught that the Geulah Klalis is nothing other than the combination of the Geulah Pratis of every individual who's learning Torahs like these, becoming activated spiritually, and then bit by bit by bit, it spreads, it rises, it's able to encompass, and that becomes the light of the Geulah.
This week's Parsha, Motet Zakala.
Yeah.
The Motet Zakala, the Rebbe Nachman actually refers to this concept of the Ma. This relationship thing, that's personal, that's between you and me. In front of the nation, you gotta be to its kifas. There needs to be not Ma. There needs to be underneath that. This is what we're gonna do.
Beautiful. Gavaldik. The Rebbe makes reference to that also later in Likutei Moharan. Excellent. Ki hadron va'asan avasur tleise yachi shad v'kachazin and the chazim and asur v'gamagel v'ninyana hanach mechayzei. Says Rabbi Barbechana, he came back 12 months later, and he saw that they're cutting out the bones of this fish. They really did a job in all the flesh, right, and the meat. And then they're chopping up the bones, and they're using it to rebuild the cities. Says the Rebbe, Kimi achayre ha'kedusha, sheim shnei maser shvatim, shal yadam nistakin malchus, v'acharei mutuma. There are 12 shvatim in Klal Yisrael, all the children of Yaakov Avinu who are tasked with healing malchus. That's our job. and we're rooted in Haya Hay V'Viyah, Yud Kei Vav Kei, which is the Bechina of Tiferes Yaakov Avinu, and we're sent down into the world of Hashem Melech, Hashem Malach, Hashem Yimlech, right, to reflect in our lives as we live out this experience of time and space. We're here to be Masakin. That's why we're on a mission. But if there are 12 Shvatim who are the Bechina of the Tikkun of Malchus to Kedusha, then there are 12 Shvatim, Chas V'Shalom, because everything is Elu Mazeh, there are, whatever, 12 Shvatim, right? There are 12 aspects, right, that are the opposite of that. Now, V'yesh B'nei Adam Sheyotzim HaKedusha, there are people who Chas V'Shalom can find themselves outside of the realm of Kedusha. And V'zeh Shesipar HaTana, this is what the Tana says, Hadron V'asan Levasar Treisa Yarchei Shata. Shahadar, he came back, v'chazer la'ayin, and he began to look, be'elu shem basar treisar yarchei shata, those who are me'achayrei, right, meaning because it was after 12 months, but it means those who are from the underside, from the underbelly, behind the 12 months, which is a very similar drasha. If you remember, the Rebbe said at the end of Torah Beis, at Torah Gimel, me'achar alois haviu, right, the David HaMelech was able to be misakin, that which is me'achar netzach v'hoid. If you remember, right, it's a very similar drasha. Those who are rooted in the back side, behind the aspect of the Shvatim to Kedusha, and that's obviously that place of Sheyotzim Miklal Yisrael Yedei Masei Marayim, where you can't even see their Jewishness anymore, and it's not even clear to you that there's a Nitzat Selikus here. The Chazin and the Hava Menasri Megamayu. He says, I looked at these people, and an unbelievable thing happened. I wanted to look at those people who are labasar tresi yarchei shata, who are rooted in the opposite side, the side that's conflicting, the side that's contrasting to Kedusha, and I saw that their bones are rolling around. Menasri migarbayu, it's cutting up, chopping up, meaning they have in their bones, like we learned, all of the oisios of the loisaseids, the tzirufi oisios, like it says by Yehuda, that his bones were megugalim until Moshe Rabbeinu, the tzaddik, the chacham, is bringing out his vidoy before HaKadosh Baruch Hu. These etchings are being carved in kinesira. They're being like chopped into the bones. And this is a new element in this whole revelation, through the fact that the Isha Yisraeli HaNizkar Le'el, the person whose tefillah was muvubeles with a sheretz going into the nostril, who found the need to go to the tzaddik and to give tzedakah to the tzaddik and to do vidoy in the presence of the tzaddik, through this, that he was inspired to the tshuva process through the sheretz katan, because he perceived a certain tumah within him that was preventing him from connecting. Through that particular individual's tshuva gorem, this causes shegam elu harashaim nasu kisei l'kedusha. Somehow that impacts other people. An internal process, because Kol Yisrael Areidim Zelazeh, we're all absolutely bound up with one another. We're one soul fundamentally. That's going to have an impact even on those who are labasei treisa yarchei shata and menasri migarmayu. And v'yahavel levinyana hanach mechoizeh. Levinyana hanach mechoizeh. This enabled them to build up their own city. Sha'oizrim gam heim la'evdei Hashem. She'yivnu hanach mechoizeh. That they're also part of it. They're also part of the experience. And it goes really both ways. And this is incredibly, incredibly deep and delicate. If I, as an individual Jew, am able to assist other people to get closer to Hashem, it's possible that those others are impacting me negatively. Because it goes both ways. It's not just that every good thing you do that impacts all Nishmas Yisrael. Chas v'shalom, it could be the opposite. A person does something in the privacy of their home and they say, what does this impact anybody else? Lo yarani adam, or there's another pasuk, not that one, right, where a person says, nobody's looking, ke'eshav ishba mistarim, or v'ani lo yarenu, right, and nobody will see me. And that also is impacting others. So says Rebbe Nachman, but guess what? Sometimes, and this is such an incredible hasaga, many of us, I'd say all of us at this point, are familiar with the way in which in our own lives there could be a yirid l'tzarech aliyah. Right? We understand that process, and that's really what this whole Torah is about fundamentally. It's about the individual coming to recognize through the tshuva process that actually every step along the journey was exactly what brought him where he needs to be. And Gewalt, we said, sometimes a person's compelled into lower experiences, a person hits rock bottom in whatever area. That is, like Rav Shlomo Katz says, it doesn't break you, it breaks you open. It's the point isn't that it breaks a person, but it breaks them open. All of a sudden they're open. I was just speaking to somebody earlier this week who's, just exploring different, mindfulness meditation techniques, and he would never, ever have had access to this kind of spiritual connection if he hadn't been going through, a little bit of turbulence in his life. And it's a gift. It's a gift, and it's the same thing, certainly, alachas kama v'kama lahavdil elef alfi trillions of abdalis, to come to a tzaddik like Rebbe Nachman, you have to be humble first. You have to be humbled by life. Some people have that naturally. Some people need to be tashiv enashad daka. Kadosh Baruch Hu crushes people. But timer shuvu b'nei adam, and he says, okay, now you're ready. Now shuvu b'nei adam. Now you're a humble person. Now you've tasted the depths. Now that you've tasted the darkness, now you can return. So all of us are aware of that in and of our own personal lives. But the Rebbe over here is giving us a framework with parts of consciousness, like we've been speaking about. Bunch of data points, algorithmic, to help a person come out of their own individual consciousness and recognize we're part of something much bigger. So the Rebbe is saying the most incredible thing here, that actually the whole Klal Yisrael is one organism. And someone else's Yerida could actually be the impetus for my Aliyah. Because someone else was not holding in a good place, that caused the sheretz to go into my tefillah, which wasn't really from me, but it was from me. Meaning if we can expand the definition of me to include everyone, and we're all different parts, we were speaking last night a little bit about this, of one whole. So that person's yerida triggered me into a tshuva process, which in return then goes ahead and it helps that person do tshuva by turning them and their yerida into a kisei for kedushas. Whole different perspective, because it isn't just within you, because you are not you, right? We're just sparks of each other. And all of a sudden, it's this revelation. It's possible that I'm suffering and struggling with certain inyanim that are not mine b'chlal. It's someone else's. This is the inyan of what the pasuk says by Mashiach, that he carried our sins, right? It says about Mashiach. He's dirty from the sins of Klal Yisrael. Let me ask you, Mashiach's dirtiness is his? He's a tzaddik gamor. He's not. They're ours. But who mechayla mipsheinu? Who mechayla? And guess what? All of his mitzvahs were cleansed by his mitzvahs. And the real reality is that it isn't about any particular person in contradistinction to anyone else. It's all of us. We are all Mashiach, because we all have a spark of Mashiach inside of us, and we are all interconnected, carrying each other's stuff, helping each other out in ways that we'll never know, but we're one organism. And that's what the Rebbe is revealing here, which I think is a hasaga neirah, mamish. V'zeh pirish, and the Rebbe says, ultimately this is pshat in the pasuk, Anochi Hashem Elokecha pirish, Hein Hashem, Hein Elokecha, Tavin Shekol Zois Anochi. Whatever it is, whether it's chesed, whether it's din, which is Hashem Elokecha, says the Rebbe, I want to let you know, Anochi, it's all me, and Anochi, of course, is Ani, which is the experience of Shoiv, which is where the person goes back into their guf, and Chaf is Keser, which is the undifferentiated will of Hashem. When Chaf is integrated into Ani, it becomes Anochi, and on that level, Ata Reisa Ladaski Hashem Hu Elikim Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Hainu sheteskayim ba'Hashem halodavar ve'Elikim halodavar hainu kulay hatay va'ametav keniska el asher hotzesicha me'aretz Mitzrayim. That through this consciousness of Hashem Elokecha, which is the result of the conjugation of Keser and Ani, which becomes Anochi, I took you out of Eretz Mitzrayim. The Isa Medrash, because born in a Medrash, ki kol Galuyas Nikra Mal Shem Galus Mitzrayim. All the Galuyas are called Mitzrayim, right? Mitzrayim is the fundamental paradigm for all future exiles. Yitzias Mitzrayim is the most important thing, even though we've been in other exiles. Right? But ultimately, all the Galuyas are called Mitzrayim, Al Shem Mipnei gesundheit shehem mitzayrim liyisrael, because mitzayrim just means constriction. Meitzar is a very narrow boundary. Hainu shal yedei tzadik nisbata malchusam umemshaltam shala'akam asher sicha me'eretz mitzrayim. You want to get out of Geulah, you want to get out of your own personal exile, because each one of us has our own Geulah and our own paray and our own bikoitz ruach mevader kasha b'chule. You want to get out of that through the tzaddik, and the tzaddik's consciousness that he's gifting us through his teachings, and the path, and the eitzos, and the advice, and the stories, and the music, and everything that tzaddik is gifting us is a way to get free. And then Malchus is breaking free. And it's breaking free from the Beis Havadim, from the house of slavery. This is the aspect of the bittul, of the nullification of the 4 negative traits that result from the Arbi Yesodus, which are called Avadim. Why are they called Avadim, slaves? Because Kabbalah teaches that all of the 4 Yesodas emerge from what's called the Galgal HaYereach. There are Galgalim, right? There are different entities that are metaphysical, according to the Rambam, sort of quasi-physical, quasi-spiritual, right? And they're tasked with mediating Shefa, that's obviously coming from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and coming down to the world through the Mazalis and the Galgalim. There's something called the Galgal HaYereach. And the Yereach is Mechuna B'Shem Eved, Kamuva B'Zar Kadosh. That the Yereach is connected, is comparable to the concept of a slave, as the Gemara says, Hina Yaskel Avdi, behold, my servant has become wise. Dasiara. This is a reference to the moon. When is the moon going to become wise? We just mentioned, go back to Torah Aleph, Ar Halavana Ka'ar Achama. How does that happen? Through Seichel, meaning via Data Ayom V'Shivos Elavavecha. Then a person comes to the experience of freedom. And that freedom, we said in the context of this Torah, is referenced when a person is able to get out of their own Geulah, get out of their own Mitzrayim, and a person is already living Zois Habachinu Me'ein Olam Haba, that the Rebbe said that if such a person is V'Yivarech HaTov HaMitav Al Kol Kamoila Asad Lavai, that person's already out, the person's free, and that's Hina Yaskel Avdi, because the Yereach goes out from being an Eved, and it goes Asher Yitzei Sicha Me'eretz Mitzrayim. Malchus is out of Geulah, because Me'eretz is Malchus, Mitzrayim is Geulah, Me'Beis Havadim, and the Levan is taken out of its aspect of being an Eved, and Hina Yaskel Avdi. It's illuminated. And Avdi, of course, again, if we're speaking thematically, the Levana is Malchus. Malchus is the Shechina. Shechina is you and I. Hina Yaskel Avdi is all of us. Speaking about Mashiach, but we are, right? It's a collective messianic nation. We are all Mashiach Klapa the Umas Olam. We're an Am Mashiach. Hina Yaskel Avdi is happening now through Pnimius HaTorah, through the tzaddikim who are delivering to us consciousness from that place of the beyond, from that place of the chaf, and then they came back down into their ani, and that's Anoichi, and they're saying to us, Hashem Elekecha.
Moshe Avdi.
Beautiful. Moshe Avdi, right? Michal Beisi Nemanu, right? Nema Emuna, right? That Bechina, that's Moshe Rabbeinu, who's drawing down to us, so that Asher Tzeicha Me'eretz Mitzrayim, that Malchus Me'eretz is like Malchus Eretz, is Hatzeicha is getting out of Mitzrayim. Hatzeichi is with the Chaf, right? Hatzeicha, because the Chaf is Keser. Me'eretz Mitzrayim, you get out of the Mitzrayim. And Me'beis Havadim in Yaskel Avdi L'Asiyah Raperish Ha'idiyat Tzadik Oila Malchus Min HaSitra Achra Min His Batlin Amidas Rois. Through that, the Malchus is emerging from the place of the Sitra Achra, Min His Batlin Amidas Rois, which are all ego-oriented and reactive, right? From the standpoint of a person feeling a fundamental sense of lack, and that's why they need to feel either depressed or lazy, or running after Taiva, or Dvar B'Telim, Stam, wasting time, which is an escape, or Gaiva. It all comes from a fundamental sense of deficiency. And the deficiency is illusory. It's illusion, right? Because there is no deficiency. There's a deficiency because we identify with ego, which is always fundamentally deficient because it's split off from the divine. But if a person recognizes that I'm actually a spark in the ocean and that behind my neshama, I have the the totality of value, the totality of worth, I don't need to be running everywhere else for self-worth. I have it fundamentally, not from the outside, but from the inside, from the neshama of my neshama. And that's the ultimate bittul, and that gives the person the ability to be nisbatal b'nisrais, and through that a person can come to the aspect of Olam Haba l'Bechinas b'Hashem halo davar b'Elikim halo davar. And I think now the Chevra understand how you can write a whole book on each Torah. You know, this Torah is everything. You can write hundreds and hundreds of pages. The Rebbe said, my Torah is only hakdamas. We're not finished Torah Dalet. The Rebbe now gave us a hakdama. This is a whole philosophy of Judaism in three and a bit pages. A whole philosophy of Judaism. You know, so again, just from the standpoint of curricular materials, you know, there's so much to give over to our youth. There's so much to give over to our adults. There's what to learn, Yesh Ma Lilmod, and we're just doing it very quickly, but what a gewalt. It's I think, heavenly. Hadron Alach, Torah Dalet, Hadron Chalam. Let's try to keep the questions for after, okay? I'm sorry, just for time constraints. So let's jump in and begin to Torah. Hey, Lashon Rabbeinu Zechon Levracha B'chat Tzotzros V'Kol Shofar Real Lifnei Hashem. To blow trumpets and the voice of the shofar hariu, you should blow trumpet, shofar blast before HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Says Rebbe Nachman, unbelievable thing. Kitzar chol adam le'mar kol adam le'nivra le'bishvili. The Gemara in Sanhedrin says that every person needs to say that the world was only created just for me. And this is a direct continuation from Torah Dalet. And as much as a person rose up to that place of total bittul, and then you come down into a body and you recognize that gewalt, I contain the totality of the Ein Sof Mamish in my being. So what are you going to do with it? Are you going to put your feet up now? What are you going to do? So now the whole world revolves around you because you're the infinite embodied in a human. So what are you going to do? Says the Rebbe, hold on one second. What, the world was created for you? Do you know what that means? Nimtza? That means that if the world was created for me, that means that it's not mine to enjoy, it's mine to fix. That's what it means. Is not like an egoic kind of self-centered perspective. On the contrary, it's the ultimate achrayus. It means that I am responsible to heal the world. Yes, you. Yes, me. Each and every one of us. And to do my part to fill the lack of the world. And at the very least, or maybe at the very most, depending. And to daven. Just to daven for the world. Do we daven for the world? Do we understand that the world is in our achrayus, it's our dominion? Not just to daven for ourselves. Gewalt. And it turns that Maimer Chazal on its head. Mesilas Yesharim says a very similar thing. There are other sources, Dagamach and Ephraim, have it over here, Naim Melech. The different tzaddikim say the similar thing, but it flips the whole way that we usually think about Bishvili Nivra Olam, and it's no, Bishvilcha Nivra Olam L'Sakein. Unbelievable. Now the Rebbe says an interesting and enigmatic thing, but this will come to an end. Ve'inin atfila, hey b'shnei panim. There are really two aspects to prayer. Hainu koidim gzar din mispadel keseder atfila. Before a gzar din has already been handed down in Shemayim, before that's already been decided, you can just daven with words of tefillah. Ve'in tzarech lahalbish atfila. You don't need to conceal or enclothe the tefillah in any way, which you're going to learn what that means. But once the gzar din has already been handed down, then you have to hide the prayer in such a way that the malachim that are rooted in the side of the small, in the side of the antagonist, in the side of the accusatory forces, the mekatrigim, are not going to be mekatrig. And this comes from a pasuk in Daniel, really the words of Nebuchadnezzar, speaking to Daniel Belshazzar, B'gzeras Irin Piskamin. He's telling him about his dream. He says this came from B'gzeras Irin Piskamin, from the decree of the holy angels, Hanala Achar Gzar Din, a reference to after the Gzar Din has already been established. Azai, so the pasuk continues, B'meimar Kadishin She'eltin. It's really in the sources V'meimar, okay? But B'meimar Kadishin She'eltin. right? Which means, on a simple level, it emerged from the utterance of on high. But he says, well, it's telling you that b'meimar kadishin she'eltin could mean to ask. And so after the gzar din of b'gzeras irim piskamin, the only way is she'eltin, is to ask for what we need, b'meimar kadishin, to sort of enclose what we're asking for in a meimar kadishin, inside in a mimer. Hazai, Hatzadikim, and of course there's a very high madrega, but we're going to have to learn it in some way that's applicable to us. But the tzadikim are malbishim she'ilasim b'maimer. They turn tefillah into Torah. Right, so Rebbe Nachman has all over the place turning Torah into tefillah. We have to realize that the only reason you're able to turn the Torah into tefillah is because the Torah was actually tefillah that was turned into Torah. And so all you're doing is just reverting it back to its initial, because this whole book, this whole sefer is a book of tefillahs. Because Rebbe Nachman is putting tefillahs into mamarim. And the obvious question is, well, how do you know whether something is before Gzar Din or after Gzar Din? And with that, Be'ezras Hashem will continue tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody on the call and in person. Ashreinu Matev Lakeinu.
וקיים על כל נשימה שאני